All right, it's noon, so we'll get started. Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our second session of Thrive Court series on mental health, developed and presented by Community Alliance. Today's topic is how trauma can impact mental health. And before we dive in, I wanted to give a brief overview of Thrive Court in case you missed it last week. Thrive Court is a new project here in Douglas County, developed with support from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Douglas County Attorney's Office, the Public Defender's Office, Center on Children, Families, and the Law, the Court Improvement Project, Community Alliance, Lutheran Family Service, the Nebraska Judicial Branch, and various other private defense attorneys and guardian ad litems. Collectively, we are seeking to improve outcomes for state wards and their families where the main reason for court involvement involves a parent with a serious mental health diagnosis. We are going to try to capture these cases from the very beginning, pair these families with specially trained and designated case managers, as well as lawyers who have special interests in these types of cases and have gone through this training series. Families will have monthly court team meetings, more frequent review hearings as well. If anyone would like more information on the process, including any lawyers who might want to be included in taking on these cases, please contact me. Other housekeeping matters, today's session's been approved for 1 hour of CLE credit. There will be a link in the chat for a certificate that you can download and save for your records. Also, a recording of this session, as well as last week's session and all future sessions, can be found on the Court Improvement Project's YouTube channel. I looked this morning and last week's session's already uploaded to the YouTube channel. All right, our presenters today are Stacy Ring and Jeff Wiebel with Community Alliance. Stacy is a licensed independent mental health practitioner and has been the manager of the Behavioral Health Education and Training Department at Community Alliance since October of 2019. And prior to that, she held various other roles at Community Alliance, including day rehabilitation specialist, SOAR program supervisor, and residential rehabilitation supervisor. Jeff has been the clinical director of Community Alliance since 2020. Prior to that, he was the director of outpatient services at Community Alliance and a day treatment manager at Community Alliance as well. He is also a licensed independent mental health practitioner, as well as a licensed clinical social worker. A huge thank you again to both of you for developing this 8-part series. All right, and without further ado, I'll leave it to the both of you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Judge. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully everyone can see that okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for having us. We're excited to talk about how we can help kind of support the court in all of your work with working with the parents and the youth in the program. Today's topic is, we're jumping right into it. And so I want to talk, it's going to seem like we're covering enough material for about a month, and I'm going to condense it into about 45 to 50 minutes. We're going to talk about what is trauma, how do we recognize trauma and assess for trauma, what is the impact on that person and their person's life, and as a result of that, what would trauma-informed care look like? What was our role? Some questions, maybe some interaction time about what would that look like in the courtroom? What helps facilitate healing and recovery for the people that you're serving? And finally, talking about vicarious trauma. How does this impact us? And how can we do our own self-care and take care of ourselves in this process? So why are we talking about trauma? First of all, we know that trauma has a big impact in our mental health facilities and the medical facilities. Trauma accounts for a number of emergency department visits and hospital admissions. We know that 90% of people in mental health services have experienced some kind of trauma. Many of those reporting childhood sexual or physical abuse, and many have been victimized. So we know that it impacts more people than we realize. Also, it's not just the emotional load that impacts people's abilities, but with their gifts and their talents, but it also affects the community and our health and our safety. And so, and it affects ourselves and our own stories. We talk about that extensively here at Community Alliance. How do we recognize trauma and how do we take care of ourselves so we can be best present and be available for the people that we're serving? So I do say we're going to talk about trauma. I'm going to talk about what might cause trauma. We're going to talk about triggers. This may bring up some of your own personal story or close experiences you have had or your own vicarious trauma. So it's just my reminder, taking care of yourself. That might be grounding yourself by coming off screen, looking around your office, stepping out, getting a breath of air, whatever you might need to do to kind of do that self-care. And we talk about that for ourselves too, because if we are not present, we can't be present for the people we're working with. So any questions? Stacey, are you able to monitor the chat? I realize I have two screens, but still can't see all the things I'd like to be able to see. All right, so the trauma definition. While people have spent decades researching trauma and trying to understand it, one of the basic definitions we think about is that trauma is when the external threat overwhelms a person's internal and really external coping mechanisms. So it's the external event is larger than what they have resources to handle. Now, we talk about single event trauma. That might be death of a friend or a loved one, or might be a car accident, might be a violent assault. And we also talk about ongoing, enduring traumas, maybe repeated physical or emotional abuse, living in a dangerous neighborhood, working in a high stress job, like many of you, I would say do. Law enforcement, emergency room work, all that can be that ongoing trauma. And we talk about that as complex trauma. And the reason we do is not to rate it as one is better than the other or more difficult, but we look at how do we assess for it, and also some of the interventions shift as we look at singular trauma versus complex. So trauma is more than just a diagnosis. Trauma is more than what someone has been through. It is an impact that deeply shifts how a person sees the world and how they see themselves. And it impacts all the people around them. And we'll get into more of how does this cascade effect then have that ripple to others and families and the community. So we're going to break down trauma into three parts. We're going to talk about the event, but then we're also going to talk about the critical piece of a person's experience. And then what is the effect of that experience? So like we talked about last week, mental illness is more than just genetics. Trauma is more than just an event. How a person experiences the trauma has as much of an influence as to the next steps as the experience itself. We talk about a person's window of tolerance. That window of tolerance for events can be influenced by their education, by emotional and physical supports, by their previous experiences, by family, and by the tools and the coping skills that they have in their life. We talked a little bit last week also about resiliency or protective factors. A lack of these factors also influences a person's ability to handle trauma and handle difficult situations. So wanted to just throw out the concept, what is trauma? What creates trauma? Stacey last week shared about some of the slides of a study, but you see on the screen, really anything can be considered trauma, whether that's in childhood or adulthood, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, economic abuse, significant loss, witnessing violence. And many of our families have seen that in their own homes or in their communities. We look at even motor vehicle accidents, being separated from your children as a mom or a dad can be a traumatic experience. Experiencing bullying, what we talked about in schools, homelessness is a trauma. One of the things as we engage with clients here coming into the building, we talk about people experiencing depression and they're experiencing homelessness. It's not a surprise that they have some depression or anxiety when they're on the streets, given that environment. We also talk about trauma as coming from a constant hostile environment, being threatened. You see a long list there. I'm just curious, how do you all think that social media has impacted trauma, both what you see in the courtroom and with the families you've served? If you want to put any comments in the chat.
Rachel just said, I think sharing trauma via social media has been both triggering and cathartic for my clients. And Jennifer says it increases it and exposes people who may not have experienced. And then Tracy said more exposure to others' trauma.
Yeah, definitely. I am curious, 50, 100 years, what people will look back and say about how our community handles trauma and how media has had an impact on that. And hopefully we'll be wiser even then about how to put limits onto our own media consumption. But I think this affects clients who aren't as aware. And some of the misinformation also on media just fuels that as well. So Stacy talked about last week this study called ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. And we know from researchers and for our community, the study kind of broadens our ideas about the impact of trauma in our lives. Also, this study and future studies have helped us kind of create a lens, an understanding of how we look at a person and the trauma they've experienced. And as we look at their risky behaviors, as we look at poor health, as we look at the long-term kind of substance use and behaviors and correctional involvement, that trauma lens is a critical piece of understanding that. As I said before, trauma is really a public health concern because it impacts everybody at levels that before I don't think we ever imagined. I do have a copy of the ACEs study. I will upload that or upload the ACEs quiz to folks if you're interested. Questions on the ACEs study are for example, did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? Did your parents or adults in your home ever hit, punch, beat, or threaten to harm you? Did you ever live with anyone who went to jail or prison? And so a lot of these questions, I think we, as you can imagine, the folks we're working with would say yes to. And so the higher those scores, the more impact the trauma has in their lives. So this is a lot of words, a lot of stuff on the screen, but this kind of walks through the ACEs study. The first column there on the left is about those adverse experiences. We talked about abuse or neglect, substance use in the home, abandonment of that child, loss of a parent, either by separation or by death, or someone death by suicide, or violence. And the study found that there was more, not surprisingly, some immediate neurological as well as health risk behaviors that were impacted by folks with higher ACE scores. So that might mean smoking, obesity, physical inactivity, more suicide attempts, increased use of alcohol. Now, I think we talked a little bit about last week. It's not a guarantee that someone is going to have all these symptoms. And one important thing is that as we look at the ACEs study, it was of untreated or unrecognized trauma. So what we're doing today helps us to be able to recognize it in people's lives and also help come up with interventions to help reduce the severity of the impact or the frequency of these negative effects. The other thing is we look at the third column, we think about how could asthma be linked to childhood trauma? Or how could prostitution be increased by childhood trauma? And those of you who've been doing this a while, this makes sense. But the research really demonstrates the clear link between the number of traumatic episodes and the impact or long-term impact or consequences of trauma in people's lives. We think about people with lots of traumatic experiences didn't have the opportunity then to develop or learn coping skills. They didn't have the opportunity for the resources they needed because they were attempting to cope with the trauma. And then they developed maladaptive coping skills or behaviors as a result of some of that trauma in their brain and in their body. This is kind of a lot. Any questions about that or any?
Another thing came into the chat, Jeff, from Elizabeth, who said, with different apps, learning a person's interest and feeding more posts into that, a young person can become intrigued and then be very occupied and worried about people who experience a specific type of trauma because it's continually in their feed.
Yeah, that's excellent. Excellent. I was at youth group last Sunday, kind of helping facilitate, and one of the questions the other leaders had is how many people had seen the video of the death of Charlie, and I was amazed about the number of students that had seen that, and I think that these things almost become a perseveration in our culture, and that multiplies the negative impacts of the culture of the trauma as well. So the ACEs study helped demonstrate what many of us already knew, was that there are long-term impacts of trauma in childhood and young adulthood, and even going into later adulthood. So a visual, if you do not have any trauma, 6 out of 100 people pick up smoking. If you've had an ACE score of 7 or higher, really almost 3 times that number of people choose smoking. And we can explore or ponder all the ideas behind that. But the big point is, I think, I'll confess, when I look at someone, I think, oh, why are you smoking? And sometimes we have that judgmental attitude, or why are you drinking? Or why are you doing X, Y, and Z? Our humanness is to come up with a reason. And I think the helpfulness of the ACE study and its subsequent studies is that we need to account for the fact that some of the reasons is the trauma in their childhood that is creating this direct impact to these behaviors. When we look at suicide attempts, 1 out of 100 in a community may attempt suicide versus 20 out of 100 people with an ACE score of 7 or more. So the impact of trauma, again, is linked directly to these behaviors. So why is this? Where does this come from? People with much higher IQ than me have explored the brain, have done research, looked at the chemicals. And what we see is that part of our brain that is focused on survival, that brainstem, keeps us alive, which we want and we need. That is a part of the brain that also then is got some chemical changes as a result of trauma. So when we have repeated exposure to perceived dangers or actual dangers, that creates that fight or flight or freeze in our brains. Now, this makes sense, again, because our brain is working to keep us safe. The challenge is that this learning function in the kind of pre-thought of our brain doesn't have a timestamp. So we identify all those senses of a trauma. But now, after that trauma, those senses, those triggers or near triggers still create that feeling of trauma in a person's body. So when I introduce the idea of triggers, now we're introducing also the concept of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So real quick, as we think about it, we think about people with PTSD all have had trauma, but not everyone experiencing trauma is going to exhibit symptoms of PTSD. Simply, PTSD is about having exposure to a traumatic event or being close experience to it, having intrusive symptoms, so memories or nightmares. They might have dissociations. They might have a stress of that related trigger. Also, a person with PTSD is going to avoid those cues or avoid those triggers. So we wonder, why does a person avoid a certain neighborhood or avoid certain people with certain descriptions related to that trauma? Also, they have a sense of altered mood or even altered beliefs as a result of that trauma, and also increased arousal. So all that is part of this biology and this trigger system that is created as a result of trauma. So our brains learn what is dangerous, which we want, which has kept human beings alive on the planet. And the brain then stores those responses as emotional responses and physical responses to those presents or those triggers. So really, this is amazing part of how our brains work. The challenge is that, though, when this is wired in, it creates complications for that person in the future as they experience this emotional response. So, for example, I'm out in the community long ago, and someone in my tribe gets attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. So I recognize saber-toothed tiger, the spots, those environments as dangerous. Well, if my brain didn't record those symptoms and those triggers, then the next time a saber-toothed tiger came into my village, I would be at risk all over again. Versus when we've learned that, then our village knows, stay away from saber-toothed tigers, or at least be aware of that. So back to trauma and today, a person that has had, let's say, a physical assault from a person, let's say they were wearing a red coat, they are now going to have some visceral, some physiological responses, possibly to seeing someone in a red coat. Now, you or I see someone in a red coat, and that's just part of the environment that we see. Versus a person that's now had that experience, that is encoded differently in how their brain works. The other challenge we notice with trauma is that sometimes all the senses are not encoded together. What I mean is that when it's traumatic experience, the smell might be in one place of the brain, what you see is in another, what you hear is in another. So you might have watched this, a person may have a sound or a smell and start reacting, becoming upset, becoming panicked, becoming nervous, but they don't know why. It is because their brain yet has not integrated all those senses and attached that to the experience of the trauma. Part of what we're learning about, people smarter than me, is how does the brain encode those? How do we help people recode those events so they're more aware of the traumatic experiences and then can recognize it and process it? Because what we want is for the person to say, yeah, my body is feeling this way, but it's actually about an event 20 years ago or a week ago or 10 years ago. And so that is part of how we do trauma therapy, is how we help people to recognize their physical response is out of sequence with the timing. one example, which is small, but when I worked at the Salvation Army a number of years ago, I went to Hurricane Katrina afterwards, and we helped with some of the cleanup effort. We were in a canteen, a big truck that was diesel powered, and we were providing meals for people morning, noon, and night. One of the things was that there was no power in New Orleans where we were at, so we had to go to these large tankers full of diesel fuel, and I would stand up on top of this tanker, hook up our little battery cables to the pump and pump diesel fuel back into our truck for use for the next day. I did not realize, I always thought diesel fuel, this seems very dangerous to me. If I do this incorrectly or do the cables incorrectly, I'm going to create a spark and send myself back to Omaha by a large explosion. What I didn't know is that diesel fuel is much less volatile than even gasoline. So what happened though when I came back was surprising to me. As I followed a city bus and the smell of diesel fuel came out, I realized I was kind of having that physical response to that smell. And I quickly knew what it was because my experience at Katrina, I talked about with many people, told the story about, hooking up cables and refueling the truck. But still today, the smell of diesel fuel, 20 years later, 20 years in a month, still reminds me of Katrina. And my experience in Katrina was not that negative. So I was able to remember it and encode it and bring up those feelings and experiences. Someone having much more traumatic experience, those senses might be more buried and might be more separated. So I don't know if that makes sense, if this is a concept you all heard about. Any comments or thoughts about kind of how trauma is encoded and the memories around it? Right. I'm going to keep looking. So triggers. Triggers can be really anything from the surrounding. They could be the way someone wears their hair. It could be their clothing. It could be a uniform, voice tone, an accent. Could be time of the year, seasons. If we've experienced the death of the loved one around a holiday season, often that holiday season is what we would call literally a trigger of that sadness and that grief. And as we hope that as people continue to grieve and move forward from that experience, the reminders don't just cause grief, but also can help with, we also then remember positive experiences of that person. Trauma encoding would be similar, healing from trauma, and that we're hoping that people are able to separate today from yesterday and also recognize that they are safe in this moment compared to how their body may be feeling about yesterday. So triggers can be music, can be sounds, also can be even feelings. A person's anxiety could cause them to remember feeling anxious in a traumatic experience or in growing up experiences. So traumatic events create this encoding in the brain that may or may not be all together. And then that encoding, which kept us safe back then, now is not time-stamped. And these triggers now create this visceral response in our neurological system. So some of the things we see with people that have had trauma, they've figured out, how do I respond to what my body is doing? My body or my brain is kind of hijacked by these feelings. How do I cope with that? So we will often see people having difficulty sleeping, having a sense of wanting to numb, wanting to find ways to feel numb. They often get self-destructive behaviors, maybe self-harm, maybe cutting, maybe risky behaviors, dangerous behaviors. People might have panic attacks or have a lot of negative self-talk, a lot of shame. All this are ways to help cope, usually maladaptive, to the traumatic experience in their lives. We think about even today in our own culture, we may be having some of these experiences also, given our political climate, given our kind of the globe, all the things going on, that in some ways can be traumatic. And so we see some kind of people checking out or numbing or more behaviors, or we see more agitation and rage when people don't know how to handle how they feel. Often it's a scary feeling. And often, as I say, the umbrella term, the umbrella of anxiety and fear is often anger. That top surface feeling is what we use to protect ourselves. And so anger is often a way people cope with these uncomfortable feelings. And remembering that trauma is an experience that overwhelms our internal resources as well as our external kind of coping supports and our external mechanisms of how we handle difficulties. So, how does this impact us in our lifetime? We've looked at the ACEs study, and we look at the fact that it literally changes the chemicals in our brain. It creates a sense of being on high alert, regardless of whether the danger is present now or was years ago or decades ago. And this high alert, then, we know when our brains are on high alert, we get what we call tunnel vision. So, for instance, when we're in a crisis situation and there's danger, we're not needing to worry about all the small details. Back to the saber-toothed tiger. If you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, focusing on how pretty the spots are will likely result in you being eaten versus how do you run? How do you get away? The challenge is that if someone's in a constant state of alarm or threat, then they are not able to pay attention to the cues and details that are around them. They don't encode them. They don't remember them. So imagine that a child in school or a parent, maybe even in the courtroom, trying to listen to instructions, they're in constant alert. They may need some additional supports in order to record that information successfully. Also, as we look at seeing the risky behaviors, we're going to adapt from this trauma by doing things that help soothe our nervous system or help us numb that nervous system or help us escape those difficult feelings. And so that is, as we saw in the third column of the ACEs study, those maladaptive behaviors that come along to help kind of numb us or protect us or soothe us. And as we, one of the values of the ACEs study is that we can see that those consequential behaviors then are the things that often we sometimes as humans will judge people about in our culture. And so being aware that those behaviors are often linked to trauma, we're not excusing the behaviors, we're not allowing the behaviors, but we are having a different understanding of where that behavior might have came from. And so that helps us in our interventions. And also may help us ourselves even be more compassionate as we implement interventions with people. And might also reduce our own frustration and anger when people continually seem to do things that don't make sense to us. One of the challenges of just mental health depression, families don't understand depression. And sometimes I'll say to families, I'm glad you don't understand it because that would mean that you are experiencing it. But just because we don't understand someone else's experience doesn't mean it's not real. So part of our role is how do I put myself in that person's shoes and what might I need to do to understand what brought them to where they are now and how do I need to respond to that? So we look at something called universal precautions. Like when we talk about, perhaps you've been trained in bloodborne pathogens and how we treat all bodily fluids as universally potentially contaminated. We think about all humans may have had a traumatic experience. We think about our coworkers. We think about people we work with side by side. We think about the people we're riding the bus with. We think about the people in traffic. We think about the people in the offices we go to. All those individuals may also have experienced trauma in their lives. And so universal precautions is about assuming that they have had trauma, they've been exposed to abuse or violence or neglect or injury, and that they may or may not even know about that, but that it is underreported and part of the story of the people around us. So, how do we implement this sense of universal precautions? Well, there are 6 kind of key principles that SAMHSA talks about, and that we think about how do we implement in our interactions with individuals, in the courtroom, in family visits, in our conversations. Real briefly, safety. How do we create a physical and emotional environment of safety? Maybe that's as simple as reducing loud noises, reducing the number of people coming and going from a meeting room or from a courtroom as much as possible, fewer surprises, stimuli, loud noises, also fewer people just available when possible, helping them to have some grounding with natural light or windows or some other things that might help create a sense of grounding. Emotional safety also involves a sense of under-promising and over-delivering. People that have been in traumatic experiences have had people promise things or say they're going to do things and not follow through. So I don't know about you, but us in the helping profession, our hearts ache and hurt for the people and their stories, and we want to help people to feel better. So I have to work hard at not promising something that I cannot provide, that is not possible or not likely in my resources. Following through on what we say, telling people when we know information, being trustworthy, sharing what we have with people and being honest about that, having those difficult conversations instead of avoiding difficult conversations. So part of that is that safety and that trustworthiness, as well as transparency. A third area of how we kind of create this trauma-informed care environment is support. How do we link people to support systems, whether that's a support group in the community, whether that's family? How do we get them reconnected to family or people that could be family? Sometimes we talk about who is adopted family for someone. Maybe that's a landlord. Maybe that's a previous sponsor from AA or NA. People that can provide that emotional support beyond just professionals in their lives. Another big part of trauma-informed care is collaboration and creating a mutuality, which you would think is human also, which we need. But it is even more critical to a person that's having some traumatic experiences and traumatic responses. They often disconnect from the world. They have had behaviors that have been unhealthy, and so they've been judged. And so not intentionally, but often we will step back and just start telling people what they should do. And that often creates another level of trauma or another level of not being included in their life and in their story. So as much as possible, thinking about how do I help involve families, adults, and kids in the decision-making whenever possible? How do we help, kind of even back to Boys Town, how do we help people to have some choices in their life? Pointing out the choices they have available to them. Validating their feelings, validating their experience. One of the things we talk about in mental health is people have delusions or hear voices or see things, which is extremely scary to clients. We talk about not joining the delusion, but also being aware of trying not to argue with it as well. Because imagine a person that has been argued with all their life, if they weren't paranoid before, now they do have a sense of paranoia because everyone feels like it's against them. Person with trauma has maybe had a lot of negative feedback in their life. So how do we help recognize what they have been successful at? How do we help find their voice? And how do we help just affirm how they might be feeling in the moment? Talk about this with therapists that we're kind of threading the needle between I'm not going to join the delusion, but I don't want to argue it. So I need to somehow find in the middle there a sense of I want to connect with how they're feeling and recognize that feeling, help them to recognize that feeling, and then help them to step away from that also and say, but it looks like you're safe now. You might not feel safe now, but right now you're in this room or we're sitting talking together and you're safe. So our voice and then providing those choices as well. The last area we think about is looking at what specific issues relate to their story. So a somewhat new term is cultural humility, which is about recognizing I'm never going to know everything about another person's culture. As a white male, I'm not going to fully understand the experience of a Black woman, but I can ask questions, I can listen, I can learn. And cultural humility, as opposed to in the past, we talked about cultural competency. I think we now recognize I don't need to be competent in order to be empathetic and be present with a person and their particular cultural story or ethnic story or their gender story or their community story. So part of cultural, historical, and gender awareness is just being willing to listen to other people's experience and not make assumptions. Not making assumptions about their experience based on their appearance or about something they've said, but asking questions to learn more about it. I think that's a great way to help people feel empowered and help people feel heard, is to be aware of our assumptions and ask further questions. So another way we can kind of help is to look at our language and our terms. So instead of saying, what's been your diagnosis, we can say, what is your story? What kind of happened to you, or what part of your story kind of influenced you being where you are today? In the mental health world, we ask, what are people's symptoms? We can ask that, but also asking, how have you coped with that? What have you done in response to that? How have you survived? One of the things I often say to people is, evidence is you're here now, and that demonstrates to me that you have gotten through everything that you've experienced. You've found a way through it. One client even this morning said to me, well, I had to go to the hospital. Well, that was coping. You found out you didn't have the resources and you asked for help and you got where you needed to be. So helping people kind of reframe their story and understand that they have coped with things that maybe others can't imagine, and that they have gotten through those and recognizing that those successes. The other piece, I think, is coming alongside people. So we can ask, how can I help you? How can I what treatments do you need? But also, what can we do together? How do we partner in this? And how do we figure out what works best? And working side by side with people so they feel like someone's in their court, literally, and supportive of them. Trauma-informed care is not about making excuses for people. It's not about avoiding natural consequences. It's about recognizing what has happened to people, recognizing some of their story, helping people to name some of the story, and then thinking about what resources can we bring to people to help shift what their available resources are. Also, you probably have heard of strength-based interventions, looking at not just what we want people to eliminate from their life, Yes, I want them to use less alcohol. We talk about harm reduction. We talk about ways to be safer. But also, what are the things we want people to add to their lives, to have a focus for that helps them to be inspired, to help them know what to do next? The old cliche, which I think is a good one, it's difficult to stop thinking about pink elephants. Sometimes a trauma-informed care approach is about what can we help people to add to their lives and to focus on in addition to some of the challenges so that they can use their gifts and their talents and get back to living who they need to be and who they're made to be. We look at resiliency, and Stacey talked about this last week, and what things help to people to be more supported. So we think about therapy, think about helping people get connected with a therapist and a therapist that has experience with working with trauma. We think about how to link people to supports in the community support programs, assistance programs, AA, NA, CA, all resources and support groups. We think about even material resources when we can have that. And I think that's when you all can reach out to folks like us that know of resources in the community, whether that's material resources, food, clothing, shelter, or other kinds of basic needs that exist. And without those needs being met, people feel destabilized and unsafe. They talk about how to help people get back to healthy activities. And also another big area which we've heard more about is what we call body work, helping people to reconnect with their body, which seems like a strange thing, but often with trauma, people have numbed or they've separated or they've disassociated. And so helping people to do activities, resources, supports to reconnect their body, their physical experiences with what they're thinking, then helps them to reintegrate those two areas and also helps them to have then more awareness. We can't respond to our own anxiety and recognize that I'm still safe if I don't even know I'm feeling anxious. I think we've seen people go from 0 to 60 to that intense feelings and then react to those feelings when in actuality they're physically safe, but it's the emotions that's setting them off. And causing that reaction. So reconnecting people with this body work is another way to help people feel grounded.
Jeff, there have been a comment and a question in the chat. First, Mariah said, "I completely agree with how you word things can set the tone, especially when someone has been through a lot and another person doesn't know what he or she has been through." And then Elizabeth asked, "Can you describe the dissociation or fabrication response when overwhelmed? How does the client typically demonstrate or experience this?"
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, thank you. Our wording and our language is very important. We even here at Community Alliance have been practicing, even the word crazy is not a nice word. And so how do we come up with other ways to describe what people are experiencing in our culture? So language can be a big part of this change. So disassociation, what does that look like? Sometimes it's people looking like they're no longer present. They might be staring off into the distance. They might be shutting down verbally. They might have less emotion on their face. Sometimes it's as simple as people not willing to talk about what you keep wanting to talk about. That's kind of a form of disassociation in that I can't handle this topic. I'm not able to handle the emotions around this topic. And so I keep redirecting it. I keep talking about something else or focusing on someone else. Disassociation can be also using drugs, drinking alcohol. I confess, even scrolling on your phone, finding ways to just kind of numb out. Not just drugs and alcohol, but media. Maybe it's food. Maybe it's reckless behavior. All those are ways to respond to difficult emotions that we maybe didn't know how to cope with. And sometimes these behaviors are not maladaptive. I'm not saying that whenever I open up Facebook, it's unhealthy, but I think the variable is when when we are in those things extensively, and it's been 45 minutes or an hour or 2 hours, and we didn't realize how much time has passed. And clients often talk about that when they are disassociating. They don't remember what happened some day or some other time in their life. Does that, Stacy, help out? What would you say?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that, the person just, people who have experienced this and have been living with this for a long time tend to kind of, sometimes they don't realize that they're doing it, but also sometimes they've learned ways to kind of mask it so that they look like they're present, but they're not really. So they may be looking like they're giving you eye contact, but there's nothing in their facial expression that indicates that they really are listening. So they might be actually nodding their head, but they're not really absorbing the words that you're saying. Or they could also, like Jeff mentioned, kind of look like they're looking through you almost, or past you. And it could be that their attention is distracted somewhere else. Some people will do things like, just looking down too. Just they're not, because they're not attending to the situation. And then, another way of kind of masking too is to give you the generic answers, like the I don't knows and things like that. So something that can be helpful in that is to try to use the person's name before you say something, because that can kind of draw them back sometime. And helping them with those things, or saying their name at the beginning and saying their name at the end of what you're saying, or repeating like your ask of them at the end. So if they were not tuned in and they lost part of it, you've kind of repeated it for them as like a recap, but it may be the first time they're hearing it versus the second.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think too, like the medical profession does a trick of, I give someone instructions and I ask them to repeat them or teach them back to me. And I think that's not because we're trying to insult the people we're working with, but we're checking to see what information they have. And might be helpful whether they're disassociated or not, because they may or may not have gotten the whole story due to kind of their own alarm state.
Yeah. Elizabeth asked a follow-up, is fabrication related to this, or is it more making up something? And I think from my experience, we don't want to call people liars because that's not usually what they're trying to do. Sometimes they are, but for fabrication, sometimes they're trying to fill in the gaps of what they missed. So if they kind of tuned out, they might be trying to just figure out what was missing and fill it in, or create a different explanation, because who would want to say I don't know where I went mentally, or I was having a flashback. So they may kind of try to fill in the gaps for things that happened when they weren't fully present or were distracted by something that you weren't aware of. Do you have
Also, fabrication makes me think too about, we'll talk more about it. We talk about substance use, but sometimes people in their stories, if they've been using substances or having other experiences, they have been defending that substance use with distortions and fabrications and lies. Then when they're in recovery, sometimes they have to relearn that telling the truth is helpful. Telling the truth is actually okay and safe. And so sometimes that gets confusing as well for people.
Ashley also just asked, is this close to guiding them if we don't be careful of the words we use? What if they completely dissociated and don't recall what we have said then and think we are coaching them? And so I think with that one, something you can do is, at the beginning of interactions, and maybe even during those interactions, give the person permission. If this gets too heavy or your mind goes somewhere else, if you need me to repeat something, feel free to ask, and just, kind of reinforcing those messages that it's okay to ask. There's no judgment here. We're just trying to help make sure you understand, or be sure that they understand the question before they give an answer, or recap that, like, okay, so this is what that means. Is that really what you thought you were agreeing to, or, what you thought you were answering? So.
Yeah, and I think also, especially like even maybe in a courtroom or asking questions, you can say to people, I recognize this is not always comfortable. What will be a sign for you when you kind of need a break? Or what will be, how can you communicate to me that you need a little break or need to pause? Or how can I kind of help you to stay grounded? And sometimes having that conversation will help people as well. I know we're almost out of time. I just want to touch briefly on the idea of, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my screen here. Compassion fatigue. We work in a challenging world, and often what we see and hear is very intense. And sometimes that can create a fatigue, a lack of energy, and a sense of being overwhelmed. And so that looks different for different people. But I think gone are the days when we can say, oh, you just have the perfect boundaries on your job, everything will be fine. Our work is difficult. And even with the best of boundaries, this is hard. And so building an awareness of ourselves, of the difficulty of what we're experiencing, and also doing that self-care can go a long ways to helping us to stay present with ourselves, our work, and our families and our lives. Just real quick, some of the activities we can do that seem very simple, but that have a big impact. Physical movement. There's a lot of research behind physical movement and helping us take care of our bodies, also takes care of our brain and helps us kind of discharge some of that intense chemicals that we experience. You see the list up there by these two researchers: crying, laughing, being creative, having social connections. All these are ways that we can ground ourselves, take care of ourselves every day in the work that we do, and build a sense of our own awareness of how we're doing with the trauma that we're experiencing. So I'm going to pause there and kind of take some additional questions. I know I've gone through a lot of material. I get kind of excited and going. So
there are a couple of videos that Jeff has included in the PowerPoint. I think the last couple of slides. One is for those of us that watch a lot of TV. It's The Pit, and it's like the first episode, the kind of the opening scene between two doctors, their emergency room doctors, and talking about the impact of the shift on them, and then there, and also for those of us who like The Pit, it's a 12 episode series that goes through a 12-hour shift in the ER, but each episode is 1 hour of the shift. And it likens it, I think, to a lot of the things that many of us experience. Our days are really heavy with a lot of things. And it talks about how, like, this is one episode per week, but imagine having 12 straight hours of this every day that you go to work, or every day of your life, and what the emotional impact of that is. And then another video that he shared is the victim impact statements from the Idaho college murders. I think that is a great thing to watch. It's not an easy thing to watch, but especially the surviving roommates, because the judge and the attorneys were very, very careful to be so supportive of those individuals and the trauma that they had experienced and are continuing to experience. And the roommate who testified herself gave a very long but very descriptive explanation of the initial trauma responses that she had and how long it's taken her to get to a place where she's more functional, as well as the things that she's seen as, and people tell her all the time that she's so strong and she's so resilient, but that's not how it feels inside. that she's masking pretty heavily. So those links are in there as well. So
I will send out the PowerPoint. It will have the 2 links in there. My tech savviness, I will put the 2 links in this in the chat. But if they'll also be in the PowerPoint.
Great. Well, thank you so much. The certificate of attendance is also located in the chat for everyone who needs that. And a reminder that this has been recorded. It will be on the Court Improvement Project's YouTube channel shortly, along with all the other sessions that we've had. And we'll have our next session is October 8th. Mood disorders, what they are and how they present. So again, that's October 8th from 12 to 1. Sign up for that if that interests you. Thank you again, Stacy and Jeff. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for taking your time. Thank you so much.